A walk and a talk. 2 2. Hey hey 1 2. Testing 1 2. This is an audio test for Sven. 2 2. This is You might get a little bit more level off this. I've got it down a little bit lower than I've been rocking it for people, but some people eat the mic and some people hold it down at their belly button. Okay, so this will be truer to levels here on the lectern. 1 2 3. Good morning. Welcome to Oceania. Tahirua, toru fa. Ichi ni san shi. 1 2.
For quite some time, I think we've all been aware anecdotally of differences in salary between New Zealand SMO positions and Australian ones. And we know that there are many New Zealand trained doctors in Australia. We've got the World Medical Association data showing migration from New Zealand to Australia. Anecdotally, I think several of us, or quite a few of us, have trainees that we know that we've had as medical students, junior doctors, go into advanced training, so they go through all of that training and then end up in Australia at the cost of New Zealand. And so we've been interested in the reasons why this is. Salary is one of the obvious things to look at, but also it's one of the more difficult things to look at. We know that the salary arrangements in Australia are very different than in New Zealand, all sorts of different arrangements across the states and within states. And every time I've asked Ian to think about doing this type of analysis, there's sort of a low groan of, oh God, sort of, this is so difficult. But earlier this year, we made a decision to get Bill interested in doing research on this, and Ganesh Nana has done an excellent report, or Bill has done a very excellent report for us, and Ganesh has kindly agreed to present that to us this morning. So, just from our bio we've got here, Ganesh is a research director at the Business and Economic Research Consultancy. He has also been a tutor, lecturer, researcher and advisor in New Zealand and England. He was a member of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, which recently completed its report on overhauling the social security system to make it more fit for purpose for the coming decades. So I think we can see that Ganesh is highly qualified to give us this presentation. Thank you very much, Ganesh.
E ngā iwi, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e rao rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for giving me your time and the opportunity to present a little piece of work that we've been doing on your behalf. My name's Ganesh. I'm Research Director at Burl. I'm a first-generation New Zealander. I actually was born and bred here in Wellington. I haven't travelled far, so for those who have come from afar, welcome to my home. We haven't quite put on our best weather for you, but believe me, it's better than it can be here. Also, believe me, it can be way much better. I suppose first thing just to note, for those who don't know, Bill, despite some misconceptions, is not a government department. We are not funded by government or ministry. We are purely private, and we live on the basis of the work we do. We believe we must be doing something right because we've survived 63 years in business. So that's, I suppose, is our credibility. I'd like to just acknowledge my colleagues at Burl for putting together this piece of work, and in particular Merwin Groom, who was the person who did most of the grunt work on this. And it was a little bit challenging exercise. I suppose the immediate challenge that we found is that cards on the table, we're a living wage employer and quite proud to be that, and I'll say that our interests are probably at the other end of the spectrum in terms of the salary scale than some in this room. And we saw, and there was a few murmurings around the team about why we should be interested in helping doctors who are earning way much more than they would ever, etc. You know the story. But we can go into that discussion a bit later if you like. From a straight economic perspective, there is quite a challenge for economists to explain why is there this stark salary differential, given that there's we are one labour market in the jargon between New Zealand and Australia, and all theory should say that there basically should be pretty close to the one salary for the same job across that labour market, allowing for a few exceptions. Okay, we'll have some allowances for remote work and a few other things and all of those sorts of things, but there is some get some significant issues for us boring economists to tackle. And then putting all of that aside, there is the consequences of having that large salary differential around attraction of good staff, retention of good staff, losses of staff, and all of those things, especially if we are in the, dare I say it, in the well-being game in New Zealand. How do we look after the well-being of New Zealanders if we don't value those who we put our lives trust in, for want of a better phrase? So, without going too much further, we'll cut to the chase. As I've said already, it won't surprise you, and it didn't surprise us, that there's a salary differential between New Zealand and Australia for this particular occupation. The thing that did surprise us, and definitely did surprise me, is the size of the differential. It's way bigger than what I had expected. Just as a rough rule of thumb, New Zealand salaries roughly about sort of 20 to 30% below Australia is sort of a ballpark rule of thumb. And that's, and again, I can't explain it. We could go into that question a bit later as well, but that's where we roughly are, and I wouldn't have thought of this occupation would be too far from that. But anyway, just in terms of what we're after, we are looking at the labour market, and there are intricacies of awards and agreements that we need to look at. We tried to keep things simple, so we're not going to go too far into all of the nitty-gritty of the different allowances and benefits that each of the different awards offer. But what we did do is combine up the allowances that are pretty close to universal across the various states or across the individual states and in New Zealand. So we were comparing apples with apples. We were going to compare like with like. So even though they said it was an allowance, if everybody got it, we lumped it into that salary number that we were trying to compare. We did have a look at, and we have noted in purely qualitative sense, to help with the narrative, those other non-salary benefits, just to, I suppose, flesh out the picture. And then also what we need to do is actually just have a quick look at the cost of living across in both areas, on one side of the Tasman and other, because there's the argument, well, we do know that salaries are higher in Australia because the cost of living is higher in Australia for certain things, and we sort of put that into the equation and just see if that justifies the differential or not, or to what extent that may justify the differential. Cutting to the chase, step one, where do you start? There's the, I won't say the headline number, but there's the starting point in terms of where the differentials are. The starting point for New Zealand in Australian dollars, okay, all the numbers here are in Australian dollars, just to convert and make the comparisons easy. In Australian dollars, the starting number for New Zealand is is pretty close to 153,000, okay, which is where we start on the left-hand bar. And all of the others are all the various Australian states. I should point, we did exclude, or we didn't look at the smaller states because they really did complicate the matters and they didn't really have comparable agreements and all those sorts of things. So we exclude Northern Territory, ACT and Tasmania, and some others who can enlighten me on the intricacies of those particular areas can go down that route. But it was just, I suppose, would have spent a lot more time for very little extra information, or very little extra for this picture. The Australians, the states, in terms of comparison to that 153,000 number for New Zealand, you're looking at a range from Victoria at just under 230,000 to Western Australia at about 295,000. So that's where we're starting from. And that's a pretty scary picture for me in terms of the rough average, and there's an argument about whether we average all of those Australian states by the population in the Australian states or the number of doctors in the Australian states and all of those sorts of things, or do we take the median or the minimum or the maximum? But just even looking at that picture, you can see the numbers are not very favourable or attractive if you were looking at, do I work in New Zealand or do I work in Australia? Okay, if you take just a simple average of those 5 Australian numbers, you get about $254,000. So you're looking at a number where New Zealand doctors are earning about 60% of the Australian average. Okay. So that's a pretty stark, dare I say, cost for the joys and wonderful benefits of living on this side of the Tasman. We have got a bloody good cricket team. Yeah. We're number 2 ranked in the world. And where are the Australians? I think they're about 5 at the moment. It's a bit sad, isn't it? And who holds the Netball World Cup? Right, okay. So there are attractions on this side of the Tasman, but do they justify that? Then, well, as an economist, we still do have you sitting in this room in New Zealand, so I ask you, why do you stay here given that differential? So, okay, you're way above that number, but you're not all the start. Well, I don't know how many, but I would assume that most of you, or at least some of you, are not on that starting level. So where do we end up? Okay, and the actual, if you've got good eyes at the back, the vertical axis changes, the numbers on the vertical axis change, but the actual picture doesn't that much. So where do you end up? Well, the difference between also where you end up is the level, the amount of time it takes to get you to end up here. Because in New Zealand, as if you don't know already, there are 15 steps, 15 annual steps between step 1 and 15, so roughly 15 years to get from the previous picture to this picture in New Zealand terms. In Australia, the steps range between about 6 and 12 to get to the top. And again, oops, I haven't got the numbers. I've got the numbers somewhere. But the range from the top for the New Zealand top in Australian dollars is about 227. Okay, Australians range from about 313 up to 384. Okay, so it's not a nice story. Well, it's not a pretty story on pure salary numbers on their own. And so to tell you in words, if you don't like the pictures, what you probably know already, but at least now you've got some numbers, and you've got some numbers that haven't been given to you by your own advisors. They are numbers from, and I'm not being an advocate for your union, okay? It's up to you to decide what you're going to do with these numbers, but it's a pretty strong evidence base that there is a large discrepancy. To me, I can argue about whether the actual salary comparison makes a difference, but it's actually the story inside those salary scales that I find quite curious and actually quite significantly, from my perspective anyway, quite a lot more important. One of them is that salary progression, as I've mentioned, in New Zealand is a lot slower. So you're talking 15 years versus sort of 6 to 12 years, and that's quite a significant difference. If you are, in terms of an attractive career path, okay, I'll live with being paid a lot less in my early days, but I would like a little bit of, I suppose, you want a little bit of gravy at the end, or a little bit of excitement or enticement. I suppose the interesting thing also from a boring economist perspective, throwing away the New Zealand-Australia comparison, if I just go back to that previous slide, is actually the not disparities, but the differences within Australia itself is actually quite different as well. So that throws away my economist hat about all the salaries should be roughly about the same, because it's a pretty, there is one labour market within Australia as within across Australia and New Zealand. So there's actually, again, there's a bit of a question mark about what's driving the differentials within the states between, say, Victoria and Western Australia. In terms of what we pick up is that there are lots of add-ons and pluses within Australia with all the peculiarities within the different states in terms of their agreements. Queensland, for example, 50% on top of base salary, which is pretty close to comprehensive, plus some allowances if you happen to be in Queensland but outside of Brisbane, so there's a whole lot of rural allowances. We've included that 50%. That is pretty much for everybody. We've included that in the previous numbers. So that's comparing apples with apples. But there's the additions if you want to live outside of, or if you're needing to be enticed to live outside of Brisbane or reside or work outside of Brisbane, these extra allowances. One would suggest that, well, I don't know whether they may or may not be needed, but one would suggest they probably are. And again, that's probably the marketplace working with a bit of luck, hopefully. Similarly, and I'm not quite sure how we can, I suppose, explain this one, but the New South Wales one, another 17% in terms of special allowance across the board. I'm not entirely sure what that is, but it's there, plus a private practice allowance. And there's a whole lot of ins and outs in terms of private practice availability and allowances, which just makes the picture just a little bit messy. But we've tried to include as much in the previous numbers as were, pretty much comprehensive. So we lock that into the overall numbers to make them, as I say, comparisons with apples and apples. To me, this is the picture that really hurts. So again, the vertical axis is Australian dollars, and the New Zealand picture is that bottom line, and the salary progression after 15 annual increments doesn't even get you to the bottom first step of the Australian ladder. Now, I have no ability whatsoever to explain that. I hope you can explain it. I love cricket, but believe me, that really is quite stark. And and so you've got the increment, 15 years, you get there, and it's ongoing, but that's fine. Look at the increments in those Australian states, a lot quicker. So you're going up a lot steeper, and obviously, and they're starting from a lot higher. Some of them flatten out very early on, i.e. they reach that top step very early on, and then the question mark obviously is what do they do after that? Well, presumably they move on to other management positions and have management allowances or units or something else. Those opportunities may or may not open up for those there. But yeah, that really is, to me, as I say, I expected a differential. I didn't expect that at all. And that really is, to me, pretty inexplicable. Yeah. I'll leave that with you, just to, that's the one that really does. I understand we're below, and okay, we start a little bit late, but we end up even below the first year of an Australian one. I don't believe we're that less trained or less equipped or less skilled and all of those other things. What I presume is actually no one in New Zealand actually gets to that number 15. By that time, they're long gone. Given my economics, we're all rational, making rational decisions and all of that. But anyway, the other side of it, and all joking aside, the other side of it that does give me I'll be honest with you, way more concerned than the previous slide in terms of career paths, career opportunities, and building a skilled workforce for the future, etc., etc. The non-salary benefits for a occupation like yours, in my mind, is critical, because bluntly, I mean, it's sort of, and I'm not want to compare my career path with yours, but I'm not in my job for the dollars. I would suggest that most of you are similarly not in your job for the dollars. It is a vocation. It is a passion. For some of you anyway, I'm generalising. To do that though, what else do you have to have? You've got to be able to maintain your training, your knowledge, your skills, your experience. You've also got to be able to operate in at least a minimal stress environment. You've actually got to be able to take time out to recuperate, all of those sorts of things. This is where we're way behind. And to me, that's what worries me as a, for one word, consumer of your services. As an economist that's actually interested in the well-being of the nation rather than just the dollars. Long service leave is critical. Yeah, I have a staff that, the jargon in terms of economics, we've got to be innovative and creative and all of those sorts of things and productive. There's no way they're going to be innovative, creative and productive if they're stuck behind a desk for 42 weeks or 45 weeks every year and so on. Okay, we give them pay, but they do need time out. They need to recharge their batteries. Tell them you're not going to be creative behind a desk. Go away, sit on a beach or sit on the banks of the Basin Reserve and think for a few days or weeks and then come back recharged and those sorts of things. Long service leave, continuing medical education and the opportunities for private practice and to engage with others. Those things are, I would say, just as, if not more critical than that salary comparison. And that's where I was hoping that previous slide was going to be explained by this one. And this is the one that really worries me, all joking aside. And if we're serious about trying to attract and keep staff in this country, I think, and again, it's not up to me to tell you what to advocate for, but I'd be worried about that other slide rather than the actual salaries, or probably actually both. Just to provide the context, cost of living, everybody says, it costs more to live across Australia than it does in New Zealand. Well, I say, actually, not a huge amount. And in some places it doesn't. It actually is less. So we did a bit of digging in terms of numbers, and we sort of tried to do some comparative household spending budgets and weren't quite as successful as we could, but we did get some official statistics, household expenditure survey numbers, both in Australia and in New Zealand. We didn't use the nationwide average for expenditure. We used the expenditures of the households in the top 20% in each of the populations. So again, comparing like with like. We left out all of the frilly stuff, like holidays and all of those sorts of things, because we thought, that's a bit discretionary, and we left out alcohol and tobacco spending, because we all know doctors don't spend on those sorts of things. So we left out all of those sorts of things, and we compared, okay, what does the average household in the top 20%, so the average of the top 20%, what do they spend compared to the average household in the top 20% of New Zealand spend? Well, the average expenditure in Australia that's about 14% higher than New Zealand. 1-4, not 40, 1-4. And don't forget the salary differential, which was about, so that 1-4 doesn't quite match the whatever it is, the 60 or the 40, whichever way you look at it. So there's the annual expenditure. So okay, the annual expenditure is roughly about $70,000 a year. Taking out, it's not total because we took out all those discretionary frilly stuffs. Okay, so it's about 70,000 in Australian dollars compared to the Australians that are about 82, roughly. And so you put the one next to the other and you put income and you divide it by spending and you got what you left, and you can do as much as, You can much as you can do to that vertical axis, but the picture looks the same. I was trying to even out the picture, and yeah. So the vertical axis is different on this graph. So the vertical axis on this graph is the step one, the entry level income compared to that spending that we have. And in New Zealand, the ratio is about 2.2, but in the Australians ranges from about 2.8 up to 3.6 in terms of income as a multiple of that average spending in the top 20% with some adjustments. Okay, so that's the bottom step. You compare it with the top step and the picture doesn't change much. So the vertical axis changes again, but the picture is the same. So that's where I'm at in terms of the study that we put in front of you. And as I noted in terms of in the report and in the comments that you asked me to make for a media release, and I didn't want to be an advocate for you, so again, I am a living wage employer, and I am actually very concerned about the people at the other end of the scale, but I am also concerned about well-being. And it all goes together. And so I say, there is no surprise that salaries for medical specialists are higher in Australia than here. No surprise, I knew that. The size of the gap, though, is astonishing. Starkly illustrated by noting that the top step in the New Zealand salary scale, achieved after 15 annual increments, is below that of the lowest entry-level salary for a newly qualified specialist in Australia. And this bleak comparison of salaries is exacerbated by a range of more favourable non-salary benefits available to medical specialists in Australia. So I leave that with you. There are reasons to stay on this side of the Tasman. I don't want to see you all disappear. This is a great country we've got here. My parents came here 70 odd years ago now, and they stayed. And I'm here also for a long time. My family have lived here. I won't say we used to, I don't want to hark back to the good old days that my father keeps talking about. But bluntly, we got a lot of work to do to restore this nation to what why my parents came here or chose to come here, and why I still choose to stay here. I'll leave that with you. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa.
I think this is one of those situations where the data speaks for itself, and a few of us, I think, suspected there was a big salary difference, but I don't know if any of us really suspected that it would take a 67% salary increase in New Zealand to get to the average of Australia. It was such a big difference. And to be honest, this has thrown a bit of a spanner into the works of our thinking with regard to the MECA. There has been some intense discussion in the office and amongst the executive about this and what we do about it. And we actually really do need some feedback from the people in the room as to the different options or thoughts that people have about this and what we should be doing about it. It's really important that we have a strategy that doesn't ignore this data. I'll leave it there. So questions, there's a few hands going up. We've also got Poll Everywhere running as well, but hands are fine as well. The first hand I saw was Jeff Shaw.
Thanks very much. I'm an Australian as well as a New Zealander. I came back to New Zealand having been offered $300,000 a year back in 1998. And I remember the person who was trying to recruit me to a place in Melbourne asked me what I was going to get in New Zealand, and I very ashamedly said 100,000. So it was a 3 times differential. I think this differential has been like this for years. I reckon that what we should be trying to do is leveraging that differential to try to claim back the other things we've been talking about, particularly yesterday. So we're not going to be able to get the money, but what we really want is a better quality of life at work. And I really think the rampant managerialism that I was talking about is something which we've got to call out and say, this is making our lives miserable. You bastards are stopping us from actually succeeding, and you're actually harming patients. And we want to take back that control. I don't know how you negotiate it, but I really think that would be the leverage I think we should start to use. Thanks.
I think the second hand I thought was Chris.
I just wanted to ask about the tax differential, because that's obviously a big thing that's not only...
Yes, yeah, we can argue about the Australians do pay higher tax than New Zealand. Whether that's a plus or a minus, we can argue, but it's not going to make up that differential, no. I think that because once you throw tax into the mechanism, then you have to go, it becomes even murkier, because then you're arguing about what you get for that higher tax. So my and I don't know if we're within four walls or not, but if we go down the tax route and then say, well, the Australians pay higher tax, what are you suggesting? How does that help your cause, or how does that help your argument about you want more salary, or you want better benefits?
Just brings back to a more realistic percentage. 60 might be 40.
It might trim the edges and the margins. It won't make a big difference to that huge gap. The other thing is then you argue, okay, there's local taxes as well, then we can talk about capital gains tax and not that, and you talk about, yeah.
I'm going to go to the back of the room. Chris Nunn.
Thank you. That's a superb presentation. Thank you very much. Such a clear and maybe not such a pleasant message. Two aspects. One, I totally endorse what was just said before about using this as leverage. I still believe people leave New Zealand not to seek more dollars, but they leave because it is so damned unpleasant here that they're looking everywhere. Yeah. And if we can change the environment, I think we've got a much better chance of retaining staff. The other real question I have, however, is an economic one. You mentioned tax. Now, we keep saying we need to do more, and we talk about percentages, GDP that should go to health. We look overseas, Scandinavia and so forth, tax rates substantially more than what we do. We have. What's the economic perspective of us saying, well, why can't we, for the top whatever, over 150,000, we pay 60 cents in the dollar, and we actually translate that into a health service that we can see can be created elsewhere, and those guys don't seem too unhappy. They seem to be actually have quite a good quality of life. What's the economic perspective on that?
There is no economic perspective. That's a choice. It's a political choice we've made in this country for a low tax environment. And sooner or later, New Zealanders are going to understand that the result of that low tax environment is a health system and an education system that's failed. You know, we've got to join the dots. That argument about a progressive tax system is not won or lost in an economic environment. It's won in the political boardrooms of this country and every other country. And call me naive, but that's called democracy. We've actually got to change the narrative and the conversations we have out there with ordinary people that tax is not bad. Tax is actually good. Higher taxes will actually enable us to deliver well-being in New Zealand. And the biggest mistake this government made was to, yes, go down the well-being route. That was great, applauded, but they pretend that they can get well-being with the same tax take than the others have, and that was never going to work.
I just wanted to ask about how you think private practice factors into all this. So I'd be curious to know whether there's any data to compare the New Zealand specialists with their salaries, including private practice, with how a Kiwi would do going to Australia. So I suppose behind my question is, are you less likely, in New Zealand, the argument could go, depending on what the data is, that maybe you've got more access to a greater income. It's just not all DHB income. Is there any data on that aspect of it?
We didn't go down that route. My immediate thought, there's not readily available data, and it would take quite a lot of effort to get it because it's not collected. My gut feel, though, is that there's actually quite and others in the room may know better than me, but my gut feel is that the opportunities for private practice or additions in Australia are actually quite, I don't know, at least on a par with New Zealand, if not more so.
The other point there is that there are some specialties in New Zealand where it's virtually impossible to have private practice, so that's not accounted for.
Yeah.
I've got a question and a couple of comments here on the poll everywhere. I'll go to the question. Did you take salary sacrifice into consideration? That can make 30% or more of salary and bring the remainder into a much lower band.
No, we just acknowledged that there was salary sacrifice opportunities in some of the Australian states.
So it's another benefit on top.
That's another benefit on top, yes.
Okay. Couple more comments. I agree with the sentiment. I'm concerned about people at the other end of the scale. And but given the current brain drain, how did we get this over the wish to keep specialists here by addressing some of the salary gap and thus improve healthcare for all parts of the salary spectrum?
Yeah. Can I just comment on that? I mean, my response is, and you've said it already, I mean, you're not going to get the dollars to get that gap closed. And so from a strategic perspective, it's a question about what do you pitch for. And it has to be, in my mind, something about delivering a world-class health service that's accessible to all. And that's in my mind, that's your pitch, using the wellbeing language.
What if we can't get enough doctors to do that because we can't pay them enough?
Well, that's part of that package. Part of the package is getting more doctors. Part of the package is getting salaries that attract more doctors. But there's also another significant part of the package as well.
Yeah.
So just particularly cognizant that we've got medical students in the room. And
Oh, I didn't want to scare them
no,
away.
no, we're not trying to scare medical students. But did you actually compare the average student debt burden between New Zealand and Australia? If you're remaining in the country you trained in, are you better off or worse off when you consider that component?
Again, we didn't do that in this study, but yeah, it's that's going to add a complication, and I suspect it's probably not going to help the story.
I just want to reiterate, I mean, if it was all about the money, none of us would be here. We'd all be over there. So I do agree with the idea that we should be focusing on the other stuff. The reasons that keep us here, make those better.
Aaron from Wellington, a radiologist. I just wanted to say, when you go in for the MECA negotiations, how will you capitalize on the fact that we know that only 5.6% of the GDP is spent on health, and that there is a huge surplus that is unspent?
It's a complex question. It's one of those, we have to think about all of those things. And that those are the sorts of things that have caused the debate amongst ourselves of how we approach this. It's not easy. Paul.
I'm sure, Ganesh, thank you for your talk. It was most instructive. It's not rocket science, though, to figure out that Australia spends a larger percentage of a much larger GDP, and where that GDP comes mainly from extractive industries. Hence, the highest salary is the largest extractive state economy, West Australia, followed by Queensland. Is Bernadette Mulholland here? So I've got after those comments, I've got a question for you. How does South Australia, as one of the lowest earning state economies, pay such high salaries? What's your secret?
Probably value well-being.
We've got a great union. We'll start with that. Very positive membership. It's also hard to attract doctors from the eastern states. So back in 2008, it was very clear that the government had to compete with the eastern seaboard to actually bring doctors across, or to keep doctors in South Australia. And I've been listening to your debate over the last 24 hours, and there was a very active campaign by the membership at that time. That's not to say once we've got the financial support for the medical officers that we haven't had to fight every single year to maintain that. And so every year we have to continue to try and stop clawback. But really the actual issue is about the trying to market ourselves against the eastern seaboard, as well as a very strong membership that became very demanding that we compete wages-wise with the eastern seaboard.
Can I just follow up on that with the question? When the salary had a larger increase, what effect did that have on ability to recruit?
Significant. Yeah. So a very good recruitment. That's not to say we don't still have shortages, particularly in our rural and remote areas. In fact, we're looking to try and increase salaries to get people out into the rural and remote areas. But certainly we were able to sustain the number of doctors in South Australia and start to grow that because we can now compete on a salary basis.
Down the front here.
Oops. I'm just dealing with recruitment in Hawke's Bay. I think in the last 6 months there have been a lot of South African doctors wanting to leave. So I think of the 5 that we tried to get to New Zealand, 1 is coming, and the other, it was 6. 1 is coming to us, and the other 4 are going to Australia, and it was purely based on salaries. They saw they were going to get a lot more from Australia. Australia has made registration processes a lot smoother. I had to sell that we don't have snakes and we don't have the top 10 most dangerous animals on the planet. And that New Zealand's very friendly and kind and people are still, believe in honesty. So I had to sell our culture in New Zealand and up against salaries in Australia. So that's just what's happened just in the last few months.
I just need to read out a couple of questions from Poll Everywhere or comments. With respect to our upcoming Mecca, can we relate the data to migration flows in each country? That's a hypothetical question, I guess. I think in this room we have self-selected to be comfortable with low pay, but the group needs a kick up the arse to accept market forces are more important than a willingness to work in the New Zealand public health system. SMO wages increases are a small increase in DHB budgets, but I do want to target the wages and the extras. The gap is too stark. How do the salaries of judges in New Zealand compare with Australia? How doctors been targeted more than, have doctors been targeted more than judiciary? Do you know the answer to that?
I don't know the answer to that, sorry. No.
Okay, any other over here?
I just wondered if you've compared other professions' pays from New Zealand to Australia. Is this just medicine or is it just everybody's in the same boat?
Sorry, no, we haven't compared other professions, not recently anyway.
But I think you mentioned 20 or 30% would be an average.
It's the average. It's the average rule of thumb.
Over the back. I think this may have to be the last question, unfortunately.
Osman Ozturk, Hawke's Bay DHB. I'm an anaesthetist there. As you can hear by this flat, lifeless accent, I trained in Aussie. I came across here, but I speak to this lady, I've forgotten her name, from South Australia. The determination of our membership, I think it's salaries, condition, and actually getting a little bit stroppy. I know why I came here. I think this is the better country, but sometimes I think we're just too damn nice.
Actually, I will take one more.
In the wake of yesterday's discussion, can we make the focus the gender difference, please? Because we will get even a bigger gap. And I just don't want that to be forgotten.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank Ganesh very much for this very useful and thought-provoking talk. Okay, yesterday we heard briefly from Manel from the Marburger Bund, and today we've got the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Andreas Botzler. And his topic is collective bargaining in municipal hospitals, strategies and tactics. So Andreas has been the Vice President of the Marburger Bund, the German Doctors' Union, since 2007, and the Vice President of the Bavarian Medical Chamber since 2018. He studied medicine at the Ludwig Maximilian Restaurant in Munich and practices as a surgeon. Andreas, welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, dear colleagues. It's actually the second time that I'm here. 2011 was the first time to be here. And yesterday I've learned that there are some efforts ongoing to demolish this paradise that we have learned it is and what it is still, so to my impression. When we terminated, at least in part, the collective agreement we have with the employers in the communal hospital with the end of last year, of course, we did some preparation. I'm a surgeon, so it's easier for me if there is only one button. The first collective agreement in modern times that we had was established in 2006. The Marburger Bund has been founded in 1947. The name comes from the city of Marburg, where this first General Assembly took place. And for many years, for decades, we more or less voluntarily were together with other unions for our agreements. And in the mid of the 2000s, we were so unsatisfied and unpleased with the situation that we decided that it's better if we took care of our own stuff ourselves. So this was the reason why in 2006 we had our first new time collective agreement, and at that time we thought that we have fixed almost everything for the future. But we needed to learn 13 years later that the world has changed. Of course, the workload has increased a lot, the speed of work has increased, also the demand, especially of the younger colleagues, how their workplaces should be configured, what they want to have for, not only living for work, but also participating in the society, in their families, and every other thing outside of the job. This has changed dramatically, and there is about 25% of the colleagues, meanwhile, working on part-time. So this tells us that they have found an individual solution. Yesterday there was many talks about job size. If there are so many colleagues working on part-time, that means that the job size described by the collective agreement is obviously inappropriate. And we had many time and took many time to discuss this. So the bargaining committee I am the chair of had within 3 years more than 36 meeting days to develop a concept how this new collective agreement should basically look like. We discussed it with our membership in symposia. The last one was in October 2018, held on federal level. And we had more time than we wanted to have because the situation we are acting in got a little bit complicated. We spent years and much of efforts and money, of course, to prevent our parliament, the German Bundestag, from passing a bill which is in German called Tarifeinheitsgesetz, and it's difficult to explain because the original purpose simply had to do with the idea that industrial actions need to be reduced, especially from small professional groups and unions, pilots, air traffic controllers, train drivers, which can block the whole country, of course. And on the other hand, there was no political majority to work with these labor or industrial action acts themselves. And so they found a kind of bypass with a regulation that within one company, whatever that may be then, only the union which represents the majority of the employees is the one that may negotiate. It doesn't work because, for instance, in air traffic control, which is organized as a company, the only employees are air traffic controllers, and of course they are the majority. And we, as the doctors, were a kind of side effect of this law. They always told us, you are not meant, you are not the aim of what we are doing. But for us, since doctors always are a minority in a hospital, it was a very difficult situation. The funny thing is that nurses are often so badly organized that in absolute numbers in a hospital there are more doctors, a union member, than nurses are. So when this law came into power, we went to the Federal Constitutional Court, and finally there was a verdict. So we won in part because they said that the law is compatible with the basic law, but the lawgiver must not generally disadvantage the small professional unions and cannot deprive them from their right to strike. The theory behind this is that for clarifying the question which collective agreement is the one that takes and which is the one that will be overruled, you need to have both of them, and they need to be established under the equal circumstances. That means also the minority trade union has the right to go on strike to come to this collective agreement. So the original idea to have some law passed which simply provides that strikes are going on, or prohibits that strikes are going on, sorry for that, did not work and does not work up to now. So finally, this collective bargaining committee I'm chairing had three key demands. The first and most important one, because it's the key for everything almost, is the recording of working time. Needs to be free of manipulation, which is the case in many hospitals, because nobody wants to be cheated at the time clock. And that there should not be a reduction of the salary during the statutory rest period. We have that funny situation that during the time of a statutory rest period, you are granted time off. That means they take the money you have earned in the night before to pay your off time on the next day. This is strange, but this is due to a verdict of the Federal Labor Court many years ago. And thirdly, we wanted to have a minimum of 2 free weeks and weekends per month, because, as I already said, especially the younger colleagues have the demand to participate in the society as well. So, on the 15th of September last year, the Greater Bargaining Committee that we have above our committee, where I am the chair of, decided not to completely terminate the agreement we had, but only to terminate this in part, as far as the extension of work by on-call on-site was concerned, and as the remuneration was concerned. So basically money and time were in the focus. We did not want to terminate the collective agreement in total, to be sure that we have still the coverage of an existing and persisting collective agreement, and not to find ourselves in the role of the minority union, which eventually must not even have a seat on the table. And then you see all these dates when we were negotiating from January to May, when we, in a first step, had an agreement which was then adopted by Marburger Bund, and how did we come there? First, this is the question of campaigning. The most important instrument you see on the left, the mobile phone. We established a messenger service on WhatsApp. Now we need to move to other providers because it's not longer possible to do it on WhatsApp for certain reasons. And then there is the theory that you need, of course, to make the public your ally and the patients your supporters. You need to try to have the media on your side, and you need to provide good arguments. This is also what you do and did yesterday. But in reality, it's a kind of battle, and you do not win with convincing arguments. Finally, you win by showing strength and power. And there are a few more obstacles, like your own members. This guy is St. Joseph of Arimathea. He's not on the slide because, by legend, he brought the Holy Grail to Glastonbury in England, or is the ancestor of King Arthur, as others said, but I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Gospel of John. The important point in his description is occultus autem propter metrum. He was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one, because of his fear. And the common member is not very brave. It clenches the fist in the pocket, but is not brave enough to take it out and show it. So you need to find something to encourage the common member. And the other thing is strategy. This man is Helmut von Moltke, which was the chief of the general staff in the 19th century in the Kingdom of Prussia. And he originally said this sentence, which is often thought that it's from Napoleon Bonaparte or General von Clausewitz, that no plan of operation can go far beyond the first encounter with the enemy's main force. So whatever you plan, whether you can act how you have planned or not, you can't be sure in advance. So in present, this means that the bait needs to take the fish and not the fisherman. So all that work we did in our committee, we were sure about it's the right thing, but of course the real proof, whether the membership in general wants to have what we had thought they will have or will want to have or not, there is a certain uncertainty, of course. And something you can very much rely on is that the employer will provide the best argument to mobilize your own members, because most of the times, fortunately, they are stupid enough to say some things which makes doctors very angry when it comes to negotiations. And there's another Roman quote you may know, si vis pacem parabellum, that means prepare the war if you want to achieve the peace. Industrial action must always be the ultima ratio, so the last step you take, and the first blow has to sit. And if it comes to the situation that you need to really go on strike, you need to be sure that you cut the earnings, not the expenses of the hospital. Otherwise, they are happy that you are on strike because they save money. And this is the situation where it came to the proof in Frankfurt. And as you see, we were very successful, also to the surprise of the employers. It helped a lot to have 5,000 colleagues to have on the main place in Frankfurt, the Römerberg. So what were our demands? First of all, we wanted to have a written agreement for ruling out this law, because one of the funny things in the verdict of the Federal Constitutive Court was also that they said all parties involved in a company, the employer and all the unions, can agree that this law I talked about earlier is simply not to be applied. A little strange situation, but very helpful. And what we further wanted to have, that these communal employers, which are not only responsible for their hospitals, but in many cases also for the public health authorities, that they should continue the negotiations we have ongoing with them for years, concerning these colleagues which work in these public health authorities, because they consider them only as administrative staff or personnel and not really as doctors, and pay them much worse than they pay hospital doctors, which of course, and as you can imagine, is not very much in favor of these authorities. They simply have enormous problems to recruit adequate personnel in a first step, and they will collapse later or earlier, simply because they are running out of staff. And the result was that we got, of course, this written agreement to rule out the law on the one hand, and was as far as the public health authorities are concerned, that the negotiations have to be continued after the 30th of October. You see, there's a date which is already in the past. Nothing has happened meanwhile. Why, I will explain later on. And there were a few demands of the employers, of course, concerning personal leasing and net wage optimization. We agreed with them that this can eventually be regulated on state level by Marburger Bund organizations on state level, and especially net wage optimization is not of any advantage for a doctor, because the income level is so high that doctors don't gain any profit. And for me, it's always like glass beads you give to natives and tell them that this is a valuable present. For us, it's not, and probably we will never have an agreement on that. The most important thing, as I told you, is the recording of working time. And we said we wanted, because this is the situation, the legal situation, the legal framework, that we could have this demand only as a precondition for being on call on site, that the entire presence on the workplace should be recorded as working time, and it may not be retrospectively capped or deducted for any reason, and the time recording, of course, needs to be at the door of the hospital and not elsewhere. The key point is that it should be free of any manipulation. Whether it's licensed by our organization or not is not so much in the focus any longer. And of course, we wanted that this is applicable for everything and not only as a precondition for being on call on site. And we got basically what we wanted to have, and of course also that is this recording is to cover everything. And one of the key points is, here is the laser probably, where do I show this? That the valuation afterwards, that it has not been real working time, needs to be proved by the employer. And you know that who one has the obligation of the proof is always the one with the disadvantage. So basically there's a regulation where we want to determine the situation that often the time we have been in the hospital is later on said that it simply doesn't count for payment. There are a few more regulations, but I do not need to specify them too much, I think. And one too much. The other key topic was the free weekends. I said we wanted to have 2 free weekends per month, and of course we had an imagination what a weekend is from Friday evening to Monday morning. What we ended up with is a regulation that in general grants 2 weekends, but says certain is only 1 per month. If patient safety, for example, is at risk, it may the other one may shift it to the next calendar half year, but the big end is coming then, because a further transfer to another period of time is not allowed. So if you don't do it in the first half of the year 2020, you will definitely have a problem in the second half of 2020. And the definition of the weekend now is from Friday in the late evening to Monday in the very early morning. One of the questions we couldn't clarify is whether weekends which are within a sick leave, a holiday, or something else, and free for this reason, need to be counted in the number of the free weekends which are covered by this regulation or not. And I'll come to this point later on. If you read all this with all these exemptions, it's like a speed limit where you have another regulation that everybody who needs to drive faster can do so. But there are few measurements again, for instance, that we have to fill in applications for transferring weekends from one calendar half year to the other. Of course, we must do this, but we do so much of paperwork as doctors that simply filling this paper wouldn't be a problem at all. And then you need to know that when we finish or agree on finishing the negotiations, this is only corner points. And then we have an additional step, a kind of editorial negotiation to come to a definitive contract. And I told you we finished in May, and this additional negotiation were in August. And the question was, what happened meanwhile? Why was there no progress? The employers had a lot of problems. For instance, the suspension of both the CEO and the chief negotiator, so there was simply no one we could talk to. And then they had made in these corner points a big mistake, because they had written that the option to arrange time off in lieu will be deleted, which is a great thing, because that problem that you get free time during, you need to pay for, of course, during your statutory rest period, then would have been solved. But then 2 months later, they said, oh, that's a mistake. All the data where they should have said their complaints had passed, and 2 or 3 months later they said a mistake, but you need to revise this, otherwise we don't talk to you, as a kind of precondition for every other thing. And then, as I told you, there was the question with the weekends, which are free for other reasons. Negotiation, as I said, was in August, and then they wanted to reassemble us in the late September with the whole bargaining or negotiation committee. And then finally we decided not to go there, not to show up, and to terminate this before what we finally did. And we have no agreement on this weekend question. The employer still says they want to count every week, and we say within our rule that we have set up for the free weekends, those ones which are caused by sick leave, by maternity leave, by holiday, must not be counted. The interesting thing is that in a similar case, the Federal Administrative Court has the same position than we have. So we are very confident that if it goes to court with our regulation, that we will succeed. You never know, but it's likely, at least. Another thing to be regulated there was the question when you move from normal work to being on shift service, how many days in between need to be. And we had a very complicated scheme for that. I don't show you. The result was that there is, in general, a 3 hours gap where there may neither be working on shifts nor on call on site or off site if you switch from one to the other. Another important thing is the question how early you know about your roster. It's not very funny if you have, like today, the end of November, and will, for instance, be provided tomorrow the roster for December. So we said it needs to be published at least 6 weeks in advance, and if it does not, there needs to be paid extra money. The regulation now foresees that it's published 1 month in advance. If it is not, then there is an additional pay of 10% for all the duties. And if the change occurs less than 3 days before the single duties to be done, then there is an additional 10% pay. The other thing was that to be on call on site, we said must be limited to 4 times a month, at least in average. The best thing would be in every month. Because we often have the situation that colleagues have these on-calls 6 times, 8 times a month. This means twice a week, and this is not very agreeing with your family life, your society life, and so on. And not to be cheated, we said that the length of the on-call is irrelevant for discounting. What we ended up is also with an average per half year, and that this means in the corner point that of course there is an exemption, so there should be an additional pay for the 25th to 30th on-call within a calendar half year. The question with the free weekends plays a role in here as well, because if I have a calendar half year, that means 26 weeks, and you are on holiday for 3 weeks, then of course you must divide these 24 duties you have to have by 26 and multiplied with 23, so it's a little less than 24 duties you have to do then before you are crossing the border. In the final contract, we have now a regulation, because the employers wanted to have it regulated in a different paragraph, which is even more an advantage for us, because in every single month it's looked whether there is a 5th or 4th on call on site, and for each one there is an additional 10% of supplementary pay. And as I said, the length of the on-call is irrelevant, except one thing, that if there is a 24 duty on weekends and colleagues decide by their own that they want to divide this in 2 parts of 12 hours each, and 2 different colleagues do this, then this only counts half. Then there are so-called sandwich duties, which has always been debated between us and the employer, whether it's in according with the collective agreement or not, to have after the on-call on site another time of regular work or not. Our exegesis interpretation was always is not allowed. Now we have a maximum of 1 hour, but this shortens the time of regular work before the on-call on site time. And of course, it's collective agreements are also dealing with the question, how much money do you earn finally? You never achieve what you want. We asked for 5% for 12 months. We got for a 33 months period a total increase of 6.5%. So this is in 3 steps, and it applies also to the remuneration of the on-call on site, which our idea was should base on the individual hourly pay. It still is based on a separate scheme with different figures. And then, as I said, we have this problem with the compensatory or statutory rest period where you are granted time off in lieu. So this means that you basically pay for the need to be off. We ask for a 50% supplement to more or less cover this, because the other thing, simply abolishing that, did not work, and we couldn't demand for that due to the legal framework. This is, Ian yesterday quoted a little bit mathematics. This is how I tried to explain to the negotiation committee what we finally did. It's not needed that everybody understands this. This is the written form what we do. There was a supplement of 5% for the 97th and further hour of being on call on site, probably nobody reaches this within a month, so this could be abolished. And we have a 15% supplement on everything, and the valuation of this on-call is increased in a second step. So this compensates quite much the loss you have during this time off you pay. You need to be off and you pay with your own money for. And as far as the arrangement of time off in lieu is concerned, the employer from now on may arrange this during the statutory rest period, but not to any other time without consent or approval of the employee. So that means that you basically either receive the money or take the time off at a day you want and not the employer wants to have you off. And it's basically what we have done. So thank you for listening, and if there is any question I can answer, I will try to do so. We've got a video from Frankfurt as well, and this is what we wanted to show you. It has something to do with soccer and with Iceland.
Dieses Teamgefühl, dieses Zusammenarbeiten, dieses Probleme wegschaffen, das geht bis zu einer gewissen Grenze, um der VKA im Rahmen dieses Warnstreiks zu zeigen, wie entschlossen wir sind, wie zusammen wir arbeiten, wie hart wir zusammen für dieses Ziel zusammen agieren, möchte ich einmal aufrufen für den isländischen Klatschgesang. Jeder hebt einmal bitte die Arme und wir zeigen der VKA, wie ernst es wir meinen. Und los geht's. Wir meinen das ernst! Die VKA hat keine Chance!
This is not what we normally do.
I can just see that outside the beehive. It'd be very effective. Thanks very much, Andreas. There's one, before we have questions, there's one thing I wanted to clarify. Just to be absolutely clear, so every hour that's worked by a German doctor is paid, is that correct?
At least it should be. By theory it is, but as I told you, we are often cheated at the time clock, so if you are for like 12 hours in the hospital, you have a time recording machine which is not able to count further than 10, because 10 is the legal...
Right.
And we want to get rid of this, and at least the written text of the agreement now says that the complete time needs to be recorded, and that the complete time needs to be automatically considered as working time, and of course also paid as.
The reason I want to clarify that is, I think if that applied in New Zealand, I suspect we'd all be paid about 20 or 30% more, so that would be interesting. Questions?
Is it on? Yeah, thanks. I'm Julian Weiss from Auckland. It was to carry on with the idea of keeping account of our time. I think culturally, customarily, we do not fill in timesheets. It's seen that we're professionals, we're responsible for our time, etc. I understand that. But we really are missing a trick here. I don't know how many people know, and I think I may have mentioned this in conference before, but there is a statutory duty for all our DHBs to submit timesheet data for the work we do. It's implicit, I think, that has to be accurate data rather than made up, but they're just going to send in the amount of hours that are on your contract and not the hours that people do. And I really think that we should start as a group to be filling in the actual times that you get to work and when you leave and what that time is. In terms of the additional pay, one thing that appeals to me, can't speak for anyone else, is actually not necessarily having a lot more money per hour, but being paid for the work I do. I'm on the top step, I'm very lucky, but if I was paid for the number of hours I do a week, I'd be a lot happier than having to work extra hours and begrudging that because it's not being acknowledged. So I think timesheets, I would say, please consider timesheets, please consider keeping a record. It's a pain in the arse, but I think it's the data we need, going back to the comment yesterday. We need data. We need to show just how much free work the DHBs get off us, how much they exploit us for.
Thanks, Julian. That caused a few hands to shoot up very rapidly, but I've got three down in the front here.
Could I just grab? Thanks very much, Andreas. David Grayson, I'm an otolaryngologist, Waitemata DHB. I'm just wondering if you're taking into account the change in working style to include virtual work. We're increasingly doing stuff in a virtual sense. We're not physically on site, but we're still working. This morning I got up and just did a whole lot of e-referrals, which the beauty of that is that can be time-stamped because it's all digital. But I'm just wondering if you're taking that into account in your work.
Not yet so far. Fortunately, we are not so developed that this is playing a major role. So most of the things really happen on site. Yeah, but this will be, because it's not only a question of time recording, it also has to do with data safety for remote work, for instance, you do from at home. If you are a radiologist and see pictures, the current solution that you are sent a picture by WhatsApp is probably not ideal. This probably needs to be regulated as well in a collective agreement, probably soon.
Lucille.
Yeah, I agree exactly. I was going to bring up this point that significantly more of us, in my experience, are no longer leaving the hospital and going home and not working. We're compelled to try to get through the week and not feel so overwhelmed by the end of the week to do some hours of work in the evening or to get up early in the morning. These things are a terror because you can get your emails on them, and it's all work. And so I think counting that's going to be difficult unless we just said we weren't going to do it anymore. That's very hard for driven people who want to make things work.
This is in so far a problem as we have also in Germany an initiative that says we need to liberalize or modernize labor rules and labor laws, and coming, for instance, not to a daily maximum of work, but to a weekly maximum of work. And this is in complete opposition to any scientific finding how actually dangerous work during night and on weekends and work in a too long period in one piece is, and that it makes you sick and finally makes you die. So we need to be very opposed to this. And of course, in our agreement, we have some regulations for the on-call off-site, how consultations by phone or so need to be counted and also to be remunerated. But you are right, this will be an emerging problem.
Got one here, here, and here. So just starting at the front.
I just want to make a comment on the timesheets. We've been working hours extra without pay, and it's not so much about the pay, but it's about the job size and the service. Because the hospital thinks we're fine, because the service is carrying on, but because we don't claim the time, it's not recorded. They don't know that there's extra FTEs that are being put in by the people working. And I think it's actually quite irresponsible not to record that. And I mean, I do that myself. I would often stay an hour or two extra and not claim for it just because it's busy. But we should be doing that because we're hiding the problem.
Absolutely agree.
You are not only hiding, you are, if I may, worsening the problem. This is what we did for decades. Because the real expenditure a hospital has or should have, you don't learn about if there is free workforce. And finally, the money or the earnings of the hospitals, how they are calculated, depend on their expenditure. And if they are not completely recorded, the money you receive for the next year is even less. And this mistake is done in Germany or has been done for the last 50 years, and it's not completely solved this problem still. But we need to record what we do as much as we can, and this on-call on site, I need to explain this eventually, lives from the idea that the time that you are in the hospital by average is only below 49% you are actually working. Otherwise, you would, for instance, not to be allowed legally to exceed your working time from 8 or 10 hours to a maximum of 24 hours. And we often have the situation that these so-called on-site on-calls have a much higher workload than 39% in average. But even the colleagues say, yeah, let's not report this, otherwise we will have shift services, which are eventually even worse, and we don't have simply the colleagues to organize. What we did, on the other hand, by limiting the number of on-calls on site to an average of 4 per month, bringing a minimum staff number into the unit, because you need 8 colleagues to fill a roster, otherwise it won't work. And this may help to lower the workload per capita in a certain way.
It's one of those situations where I think job sizing is so important. It's one of the only mechanisms we have for dealing with a lot of the after-hours work that people are doing. Elaine?
Your argument for strike of the Marburger Bund is that you reduce the income of employers but not the expenses, so that you don't extend the expenses in your strike action. New Zealand, I think we have to point out how actually the hospital system or the medical system in Germany is funded. It's funded via the health insurances. The health insurances provide the money to the hospitals based on the performance of the hospitals. So in other words, it's measured how many patient contacts each doctor has. And based on the patient contacts, the hospital is getting the money. And that is calculated in retrospective. That's the funding. So it's a little bit different in New Zealand. If you work here, whether you see 10 patients a day or 5, you will be a certain amount of cost, and you will be a certain amount of funding anytime. In Germany, there's a different idea of efficiency, and that's what you use in your strike negotiations. I doubt that we have this momentum there. Yeah, and that's actually a very important thing, because you strike in this way that you say, I'm just coming for 1 hour. I just see 1 patient a day instead of the 10 I should see, which is a massive income loss for the employer. And that's what you use for your negotiations. So that's a completely different concept there you can use in negotiations, just to give the difference of the funding there.
Yeah, that's true, and that's an important point. The system we have also feeds the discussion of overtreatment, because if you treat something conservatively, then you have no procedures the hospital will be remunerated for. So often in case where you can decide the one way or the other, there is a tendency to be more invasive, to operate on patients and so on, because that's more money for the hospital. And something is wrong with that, because the major goal of a hospital should not to produce a surplus in the balance finally, but it should be to provide health. And this is what we have lost in our system. As far as industrial action is concerned, you probably in your situation should eventually even work more and consume more resources, then you are more costful if you want to be so.
This the last question for the session, thank you.
I think most people will agree that, on-call and out-of-hours work has got significant impact on well-being. So for the next Mecca, I'm just wondering, every specialty has got a different type of work pattern and out-of-hours work, and the change has also been very different for different specialties. For example, radiology in Wellington, we've noticed about 110% increase in 7 years, different to the 25% that we saw on an average. So for the next Mecca, I was just wondering if there was any kind of a plan to have a working group including different specialties, all the specialties, so that, because one size does not fit all, because an on-call done in one specialty is very different to an on-call done in another specialty. On-site work is different in one to another. So the frequency that we decide or the onerousness of duty will be very different to each. And also as SMOs and RMOs and all, the money might not sway everyone. It might be that for some people money is important. For them it might be different early on in their career, late. So the flexibility again, when we're talking about the difference between Australia and New Zealand and all, and we're talking about well-being, I'm thinking linking specialties to the out-of-hours work, at least in the working groups before we walk into Mecca, might be a good idea.
Yes, that's fine. So most of you probably know that over the last 12 months we've had a shift work working group. It's been very busy, and Andrew Ewens has been running that to a certain degree, and Lloyd Woods. So we've had a big focus on shift work conditions in the upcoming Mecca. The other thing that we do is we have a large negotiating team, and we try and make sure that we cover as many of the specialties and areas as we possibly can in that negotiating team. So we try to cover as much of what you've talked about as we can. Okay, I'd like to finish by thanking Andreas for a very useful and inspiring talk. And I'd quite like to have some of those slides on some of your strategies that you use in Germany. That would be good. Okay, we've got morning tea now. We can come back at 11 o'clock. Thank you.